The fluorescent lights hummed their fluorescent song, a sound like insects trapped in glass. Hannah Clarke moved through Mercy General's ICU with the kind of invisibility that comes from 8 months of keeping her head down, perfect uniform, perfect posture, perfect silence. She was the nurse nobody noticed. The competent one. The reliable one. The one who never asked questions and always knew where the crash cart was positioned for the clearest sightline to the trauma bays. Her hands moved with precision as she checked the 4 lines on Bay 4, adjusting the drip rate with fingers that remembered other work, other precision, other lives depending on steadiness. The patient stirred. She was already there with the sedative, already murmuring something soft and clinical that made his breathing slow. A physician passing the window paused. Most nurses asked permission. Hannah didn't. She just acted, and her actions were always right. 8 months. That was how long Senior Chief Petty Officer Hannah Clarke had been invisible at Mercy General in Raleigh. Long enough for the system to digest her credentials without chewing. Long enough for the background noise of her competence to fade into the wallpaper of the ICU's daily rhythm. Her official paperwork said she'd worked at Baptist Memorial in Memphis for 14 years before taking a position here. The truth lived in a locker 3 floors below, wrapped in black cloth, in a pair of worn combat boots that she couldn't look at for more than 3 seconds without something in her chest trying to crack open. The boots were there because she'd been ordered to bury them. Not literally bury them. Just erase them from any narrative that mattered. Senior Chief Hannah Clarke had died in 2019 according to official records. Her decorations were classified. Her team was disavowed. Her name was redacted from every report that might have mentioned her call sign, her unit, her 3 tours in Ramadi. The boots stayed because leaving them behind would have been an admission, and admissions could get people killed. Around noon, the trauma alert came through the intercom like a siren cutting through her careful equilibrium. Code red. Multiple GSWs incoming via helicopter. The ICU staff mobilized with practiced chaos, beds cleared, monitors tested, full lines prepared. Hannah positioned herself at the edge of the activity, present but not prominent, helpful but not central. This was her art, being invisible while being essential. The patient arrived on a stretcher pushed by paramedics moving with controlled urgency. Male. Mid-40s. Paralyzed from the waist down. The intake summary was sparse: Special Forces veteran, traumatic spinal injury from Ramadi 8 years prior, currently presenting with progressive neurological decline. He needed decompression. He needed it soon. The window was closing. What he needed was experimental surgery. What he needed was a surgeon willing to take a case with a 53% success probability and a mountain of liability. Dr. Hargrove arrived first. Chief of Surgery. Immaculate despite the afternoon heat outside, his badge hanging from his neck like a medal he'd awarded himself. He stood in the doorway of the patient's bay, glanced at the chart, and his expression shifted into something frozen. "Not our case," he said. The resident beside him looked up. "Sir, his primary care physician requested we evaluate for spinal decompression. He's a candidate for the experimental protocol." I said, "Not our case." Hargrove turned to leave, then paused. "Find someone else. I'm sure there's a teaching hospital in Charlotte that needs experience with low-yield procedures." Hannah watched this from the corner of the monitors, her jaw tight but her hand steady. Low yield. That's what they called cases where the patient might actually die despite everything. That's what they called it when the liability was real. By 3 o'clock, Dr. Vance had looked at the file and declined. Neurosurgery. The risk factors alone disqualified the case from his department, he explained: too many comorbidities, too much time since the primary injury, too much uncertainty about neurological recovery. His words were professional. His tone was dismissal. By 4, Dr. Chen from trauma had refused. The surgical window was narrow, she said. The team wasn't equipped for experimental protocols. Better to refer out. Much better. Dr. Morrison, chief of neurology, was the 4th. He sat with the patient for 20 minutes, asked careful questions, then walked to the nurse's station and said what everyone was thinking: the probability of meaningful recovery is too low. The family should understand that. Meaningful recovery. Hannah kept her expression blank while reshelving the medication tray. Meaningful to whom? By 5 o'clock, the fifth refusal had come through. Dr. Okonkwo, orthopedic specialist, had been consulted for secondary complications assessment. He'd looked at the imaging, reviewed the medical history, and written in the chart, "Not recommended for experimental intervention." Risk exceeds benefit. 5 surgeons. 5 declinations. The patient lay in Bay 3, stable but aware, understanding perfectly well that the only thing between him and further paralysis was a surgery nobody wanted to perform. Hannah was running blood samples to the lab when she saw the personal effects bag. Clear plastic. Hospital property seal. The intake nurse was logging it: watch, wallet, uniform patches, and at the bottom, wrapped in combat tape, a pair of boots. She stopped walking. The boots were tan, worn through at the heel. The leather was scarred from things the boots had walked through: desert, concrete, maybe fire. They were the specific kind of worn that came from 200 patrol days in Fallujah, or the kind that came from running through buildings in the Jolan district. They were the kind of worn that meant someone. Hannah's hands moved to her sides. Her breathing changed. She didn't look away. "You okay, Clarke?" The intake nurse glanced up. "Fine." Her voice was level. Practiced. The voice of someone who'd learned to lie with her larynx. Just making a mental note of what needs to be secured. She turned and walked to the supply closet on the east corridor. The one nobody used because it smelled like old acetone and had a light that flickered. She closed the door and stood in the dark for 8 seconds. The boots were identical. Not similar. Identical. Same manufacturer. Same wear pattern. Same scarred left heel where the leather had been ripped by shrapnel or a burn or a piece of something sharp enough to remember. She had boots just like them. 3 floors down. Wrapped in black cloth. Buried under winter scrubs she'd never need in North Carolina. 8 seconds became 10. Her hands were shaking. She placed her palms flat against the cool metal shelving and breathed. In through the nose. Out through the mouth. The technique worked because she'd done it before. She'd done it in safe houses. She'd done it after extractions. She'd done it in the dark after seeing things that had no names. When she left the closet, her hands were steady. Her expression was neutral. She moved back to the ICU and continued her shift like a woman made of code, of protocols, of the kind of composure that comes from understanding that falling apart was a choice you couldn't afford to make. At 6:15, the staff lounge erupted with laughter. Hannah was in the hallway restocking the crash cart when she heard it, the kind of laughter that comes from people who are confident in their position, who occupy space like they own it. She paused. Listened. "Won't make it to the end of the week." That was Hargrove's voice. Confident. Amused. "I give her 8 days, maybe 7. She's competent enough, but she's a nurse. The pressure gets to them." Another voice responded, "Dr. Vance, probably. You made an actual bet. 200 says she quits by next Tuesday. 300 if she makes it to Friday." The pleasure in his voice was audible, the way some people smile when they're holding a winning hand they haven't shown yet. I can spot the type. Good at following instructions, terrible at actual stress. One real crisis and they fall apart. Hannah continued restocking the crash cart. Her movements didn't change. The fact that her hands were trembling was information, and pain, the kind of pain that was rage, was just data. She filed it. She breathed past it. She understood, in that moment, that this man was very confident in his understanding of who she was. He was exactly $200 wrong. The rest of the shift passed with the kind of clinical precision that marked her days. Charts updated. Medications administered. Vitals monitored. The paralyzed veteran slept fitfully, his his body healing from trauma his nervous system couldn't feel anymore. And in Bay 3, beside his bed, the clear plastic bag with the combat boots remained, waiting. Hannah didn't look at them again. Not directly. But she knew where they were. And she knew why they mattered. And she knew, standing at the edge of the ICU's fluorescent light at 11:47 p.m., that something was about to change. She just didn't know yet how much. Tuesday afternoon in the cafeteria at Mercy General. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical hymn overhead. Hannah Clarke walked past the physician's table carrying her lunch tray, nothing fancy, just soup and a sandwich, the kind of meal you eat because fuel is necessary, not because you're hungry. She'd learned long ago how to move through spaces without being seen. 18 months of that training in the desert. 8 months perfecting it in Raleigh. Dr. Hargrove stood abruptly, his shoulder colliding with her tray as if by accident. As if she hadn't seen him watching her approach from across the room. The collision was deliberate, surgical, calculated to humiliate. The tray clattered to the tile floor. Soup spread like blood. Silverware scattered with the metallic sound of spent casings. 6 other physicians at the table froze mid-conversation, waiting to see what the new nurse would do. "Oh, sweetheart, you should watch where you're going," Hargrove said, his voice carrying the kind of warmth that kills things. The table erupted in nervous laughter, the sound of people who knew they were witnessing a performance and had no choice but to be the audience. Then he did it. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out the Paralyzed veterans chart. The Ramadi case. The one 5 different surgeons had walked away from. The one Hannah had been quietly studying during her breaks, cross-referencing spinal decompression literature with experimental nerve regeneration protocols. Hargrove threw the chart at her feet, let it land in the spilled soup. "Pick that up, sweetheart," he said. "Nurses don't question physician judgment. I heard you were asking about the Ramadi case. That's not your lane." He said it loud enough for the entire cafeteria to hear. Loud enough that the conversation at 3 other tables stopped. Loud enough that the kitchen staff looked out from behind the serving line. Hannah stood there, soup dripping from her scrubs, and felt something shift inside her chest. Not fear. Fear was what untrained people felt. This was colder. This was calculation. This was the moment she'd been trained her entire adult life to recognize, the moment when backing down becomes the easier choice and harder choices have to be made anyway. She crouched slowly. Her movements were precise, economical, the kind of movements that came from years of operating under fire where wasted motion could kill you. She retrieved the chart from the mess. One tear escaped down her left cheek as she stood. Just one. Her training had limits and her body had its own language. But she wiped it away without breaking eye contact. She held Hargrove's gaze the way a sniper holds a scope on a target, and when she spoke, her voice came out like steel wrapped in silk, low enough that only the nearest tables heard it. "I've held intestines inside men with less cowardice than you show on paper." The cafeteria went dead silent. Actually silent. No silverware clicking. No chairs scraping. No one even breathing. Hargrove's face flushed crimson, a stain that started at his collar and climbed toward his temples like rising water. His hands clenched on the table edge. His jaw worked but no sound came out. One of the residents stared at his plate with sudden intense concentration. Another studied his phone. They were all witnessing something they understood on a primitive level. A boundary had been crossed. Someone had been publicly humiliated and instead of accepting it, she'd reflected it back at him with interest. Hannah disposed of her tray. Cleaned the spilled soup. Changed her scrubs. Returned to the ICU by 1:51 p.m. without a word to anyone. But that wasn't the worst part. On Wednesday morning during rounds, Dr. Hargrove made a point of calling her sweetheart twice in front of the ICU team. He asked her to fetch coffee. He asked her to take notes like a good nurse should. He discussed complex cases she'd been specifically assigned to manage while looking directly at her as if she wasn't qualified to understand the words coming out of his mouth. Each time Hannah complied with quiet efficiency. Each time her face remained a mask. Each time her movement stayed precise. But her hands trembled slightly when she gripped her pen, and she hated herself for it. She understood what was happening. Hargrove was escalating. The initial public mockery had failed to break her, so he was shifting tactics. He was demonstrating that he controlled her environment. That he could undermine her authority in front of other staff. That she could speak back to him once and it would cost her. This was stage 2 of what men like him had mastered, not the explosion of anger, but the slow systematic dismantling of dignity. Hannah had seen it before. She'd been trained to recognize it. What she hadn't trained for was the anger. The cold, precise anger that didn't shake in her voice because she'd learned to compartmentalize it. The kind of anger that could wait. That could strategize. That turned grief into purpose. By Thursday morning, something shifted again. A visiting surgeon named Dr. Raymond Chen arrived at Mercy General with credentials that read like a who's who of experimental neurotrauma: Johns Hopkins, the Walter Reed National Military Medical Center, 3 peer-reviewed publications on spinal cord regeneration in combat veterans. Unlike the 5 surgeons who'd walked away from the paralyzed veteran's case, Chen looked at the imaging and saw possibility instead of liability. He looked at the risk and saw the alternative, a man who would spend the rest of his life unable to move from the neck down, unable to feel his own body. "I'll do it," Chen said during rounds. "If we can get the patient's consent. And if I have a capable surgical nurse." Hannah raised her hand. It was an unconscious gesture, one she immediately recognized and tried to reel back, but it was too late. Chen had already noticed. Hargrove's expression darkened. "Ms. Clarke isn't experienced enough for experimental procedures." "How many spinal cases has she assisted on?" Chen asked. "I don't keep detailed statistics," Hargrove said. Which meant yes, plenty. "Then she's in," Chen said. The OR at Mercy General was Hannah's second sanctuary. The first was silence. The second was purpose. Everything outside those walls, the petty humiliations, the calculated disrespect, the carefully maintained cover as a civilian contract nurse, fell away the moment she scrubbed in. Muscle memory took over. Her hands moved into position. Her mind calculated angles and tissue planes and vascular anatomy the way some people calculated change. Chen worked with the precision of someone who'd operated in combat hospitals. His movements were efficient, conservative, the movements of someone who understood that the patient's body was the last barrier between him and permanent paralysis. The decompression began at 9:23 a.m. The first layer of tissue came back clean. The second exposed the damaged spinal cord, pale and swollen, bearing the scarring of shrapnel trauma. Then the bleeding started. A small arterial branch, caught in the initial blast damage, began to hemorrhage from the decompression site. Bright red blood, pulsing with each heartbeat. Chen was calm, his voice didn't change, his hands didn't shake, but blood loss at this rate meant they had maybe 4 minutes before hypertension became critical. "Clamp," Chen said. Hannah was already moving. She'd been trained by Navy corpsmen who operated under suppressive fire in Ramadi. She'd learned this technique from a senior chief whose hands had held together more severed arteries than most civilians would see in 5 lifetimes. Her fingers executed a 3-layer arterial clamp, the first clamp securing the proximal vessel, the second isolating the bleeding site, the third establishing backup hemostasis in case the first 2 failed. It was delicate work. It was lethal work. It was the kind of procedure that separated trained medical personnel from everyone else. The hemorrhage stopped. The patient's oxygen saturation held steady at 97%. Across the surgical table, another nurse froze. Marcus Webb. Marine Corps. Combat medic. Transferred to Mercy General 6 months ago and kept mostly to himself. He'd been passing instruments with competent efficiency until the moment Hannah's hands moved, and then something changed in his expression. His eyes locked on her technique. His entire body went still. "Only one person ties off bleeders like that," he whispered, barely audible behind his surgical mask. The recognition in his voice was clear as a gunshot. Clear as the call sign that only a handful of people in the entire special operations community would recognize. Clear as the moment Hannah understood that her cover had just developed a hairline fracture. She turned her head fractionally. The slightest shake. A signal that said don't, that said not now, that said I will explain if you live long enough, but you have to be smart enough to stay quiet. Marcus fell silent immediately. But his eyes never left her through the rest of the procedure. His hands passed instruments with mechanical precision while his mind was clearly somewhere else, somewhere dark and hot, somewhere that smelled like blood and diesel fuel and the particular kind of fear that comes from understanding exactly who you're standing next to. The surgery concluded at 12:36 p.m. Successful. The veteran was stable. His spinal cord had been decompressed. His chances of recovery, actual recovery, not just survival, had improved from approximately 0 to something that looked like hope. Chen stripped off his gloves and nodded at Hannah with a kind of respect that can't be faked. The respect of a warrior for another warrior. As they scrubbed out in the utility room, Marcus approached her. His voice was low. Careful. Where did you serve? He asked. Hannah's jaw tightened. The question itself was dangerous. The answer was impossible. If she said nothing, Marcus would know. If she lied, a Marine Corps combat medic would recognize the lie. If she told the truth, her entire existence in Raleigh would collapse like a house in wind. I didn't, she said. It was the most carefully constructed lie she'd ever spoken. It was true in a technical sense. Senior Chief Petty Officer Hannah Clarke didn't serve. She'd been ceremonially erased in 2019. She was dead on paper, officially disavowed, her service record buried so deep that the Pentagon had 3 separate compartmented systems ensuring no one could access it without a presidential waiver. She was no one now. She was just Hannah, a nurse who somehow knew how to perform advanced hemostasis under pressure. Marcus watched her walk away. She could feel his eyes on her back as she moved down the corridor toward the ICU. She could feel the weight of his knowledge. She could feel the fracture in her cover spreading. That evening, Hannah stood in her closet at home. The door was closed. The lights were off except for a thin line of hallway glow. She stared at her own pair of combat boots, worn leather, salt-stained from sweat and desert heat, the kind of boots that had stepped through 423 successful missions in Ramadi. The veteran's boots, which she'd carefully studied in the hospital, were identical. Not similar. Identical. Same make. Same model. Same pattern of wear at the heel where the same repetitive motion wore through the material. The same boots that had carried 2 different people through the same hell. Her daughter Emma called from downstairs. Mom? What do you want for dinner? Hannah wiped her eyes and closed the closet door. She turned off the paranoia, compartmentalized the fear, and became the version of herself that could function in the world. She was good at that. She'd been doing it for so long that some days she forgot which version was real. But as she walked downstairs to decide between pasta and chicken, she understood what Marcus had recognized. She understood what the veteran's identical boots meant. She understood that the distance between her 2 identities had just collapsed from years to days, from secure to precarious, from manageable to something approaching critical. The phone in her pocket felt heavier than usual. It contained a number she was explicitly ordered never to use unless everything was compromised. A number that would dispatch a Black Hawk helicopter to her location within 47 minutes. A number that would end her civilian life permanently and extract her with military efficiency. A number she desperately hoped she wouldn't need to use. But Marcus Webb knew. And in the special operations community, knowing something meant you had to decide whether you were going to stay silent or speak up. Both choices carried consequences. Hannah didn't sleep much that night. Friday night fell hard on Mercy General's ICU like a curtain dropping on a stage. The ventilator wheezed its rhythmic pulse from bed 7, where the paralyzed veteran from Ramadi lay sleeping under the pale wash of monitor screens. Hannah had been watching him for 6 hours straight, the kind of watching that wasn't in any job description, the kind that came from muscle memory deeper than rank. His vitals had been stable. Textbook recovery arc. The surgical site clean. No infection markers. No complications. Just a man learning to breathe through a body that wouldn't obey him anymore. At 11:38 p.m., everything changed. His heart rate spiked first. The monitor's beep accelerated from a steady rhythm into something faster, sharper, alarm bells that started soft and climbed toward panic. Hannah was at the bedside before the second alarm fired. Blood pressure dropping. 120/80 at 11:46. Now 98/55. The numbers were falling like a cliff face. She ran her eyes across the veteran's face. Pale. Too pale. Clammy skin that had been warm an hour ago. She'd seen this pattern before, not in Raleigh, in places where medics learned to read death's arrival by increments measured in milliliters and minutes. She placed a hand on his shoulder. He couldn't feel it. His body was still paralyzed from the waist down, still locked in the cage the explosion had built. But his eyes found hers. Panic there. Real animal panic. "I'm with you," she said, and her voice was the voice of someone who'd held men's hands while their blood ran into the sand. "Stay with me." She called for the on-call surgeon, Dr. Morrison, her tone carrying exactly zero negotiation. Not a request. Not a suggestion. 3 minutes later, Morrison appeared in the doorway looking like a man who'd been dragged from sleep, and he probably had been. 48-year-old internist with a private practice uptown. The kind of on-call surgeon who showed up because the contract required it, not because he wanted to be here at midnight watching someone else's emergency bleed across a monitor. Hannah already had the ultrasound cart positioned. Her hands moved through the setup with the precision of someone who'd done this in field conditions, in the back of a Black Hawk helicopter, in convoy medical bays, in places where hesitation meant body bags. She found the cardiac window in seconds. The ultrasound probe under the xiphoid process, angled just right, the screen coming alive with the grayscale interior of a human heart. And there it was. Fluid. A dark pool around the chambers like a fist closing incrementally tighter. Pericardial tamponade. Pressure building against the heart's ability to pump. The veteran's pressure was 82/38 now. His oxygen saturation dropping. The mechanical rhythm of the ventilator speeding up as his body demanded more, and couldn't get it. Cardiac tamponade, Hannah said, her voice level as a carpenter's tool. Fluid compressing the right atrium. We need pericardiocentesis. Now. Morrison stepped closer to the screen. His face went the color of hospital ceiling tiles. I've never done this outside a controlled OR. The attending we should page Hargrove. He handles emergencies like this. The veteran's pressure dropped to 78/35. There is no should, Hannah said. She wasn't looking at Morrison anymore. She was looking at the screen. He's in cardiac shock. We have 4 minutes, maybe 5, before he codes. You're doing it, or I'm doing it. Choose now. Morrison's hands were shaking. She could see them trembling from 5 feet away, the kind of tremor that came from a man who'd spent his career in controlled environments with backup protocols and liability insurance. He opened his mouth. Closed it. Looked at the veteran's face, then back at the monitor, then at Hannah's face, and whatever he saw there made him step backward. I can't, he whispered. I'm sorry, I can't. Hannah turned to the emergency cart. The needle was right where it always was in a hospital designed for the worst possibilities, a 16-gauge needle attached to a syringe, the kind of setup that had saved lives in field trauma situations 1,000 times over. She'd learned this procedure in a warehouse outside of Ramadi while rain hammered the roof and another medic kept pressure on a bleeder that wouldn't stop. She'd done it in convoy medicine bays. She'd done it when the difference between perfect technique and hesitation meant whether a man went home or went home in a flag-draped box. Her hands found the probe. Positioned it perfectly beneath the xiphoid process, that small notch of bone where the breastbone ended. The screen showed her exactly what she needed, the needle path, clear and perfect, the angle that wouldn't nick a coronary artery or puncture the lung. She advanced the needle slowly. Carefully. The kind of slow that took discipline, that took training, that took knowing what you were doing at a cellular level. The needle sank through skin. Through fascia. She could feel the subtle give of tissues, the almost whisper of resistance as she pierced into the pericardial space, and then, there. Dark blood flashed back into the syringe. She withdrew slowly. Steadily. 60 milliliters of fluid pooling into the chamber, each pull of the plunger releasing pressure against the heart. The monitor beeped. Once. The veteran's pressure rose. 85/40. 88/42. She withdrew another 20 milliliters. The pressure climbed again. 92/45. His oxygen saturation began its slow crawl upward. The panic in his eyes didn't leave, but something shifted, the look of a man who realized he wasn't going to die tonight, not on this bed, not with this nurse's hands keeping him tethered to the world. Hannah withdrew the needle. She disposed of it properly, labeled the specimen, documented every number with the precision of someone who understood that medical records were legal documents and that she'd just crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. The urgent note in her handwriting, emergency pericardiocentesis performed at 11:52 p.m. 80 milliliters serosanguinous fluid evacuated. Post-procedure vital stable. Patient response positive. She didn't look at Morrison, who was standing against the wall like a man watching a car accident he couldn't prevent. Didn't say anything to him. Didn't acknowledge the way his face had drained of color completely, the way his hands were still shaking, the way he was staring at her like she'd just violated every rule in the physician handbook and also saved a patient he'd been ready to let die rather than risk his own competence. Instead, she checked the veterans for access. Confirmed the ventilator settings. Repositioned the monitor leads. All the methodical steps of ensuring a patient stayed stable once you'd pulled him back from the edge. Muscle memory. Combat medicine. The kind of automatic precision that came from having done this when artillery was landing nearby and you had no choice but to be perfect or watch the man die. You need to call Dr. Chen, Hannah said quietly, still not looking at Morrison. Post-emergency complication. Pericardial effusion resolved via pericardiocentesis. Attending needs to know. Morrison didn't answer. He left instead, moving like a man fleeing a crime scene, and Hannah listened to his footsteps disappear down the hallway. The ICU settled back into its rhythm. The monitors. The ventilator. The fluorescent ceiling lights casting their surgical brightness across a room that suddenly felt very small and very exposed. By 3 a.m., Dr. Chen had reviewed the case and Hannah's documentation. By 4 a.m., Hargrove knew. By 5 a.m., the incident report was filed, and Morrison had described the events in a way that made Hannah's actions sound less like emergency medical response and more like a nurse who'd overstepped into surgical territory, who'd performed a procedure without supervision, who'd undermined physician authority in a way that violated every boundary written into hospital policy. The sun came up over Raleigh the way it always did. Rain started falling around 6 a.m., the kind of rain that sounded like applause against the ICU sealed windows. Hannah sat beside the veteran's bed, officially documenting vitals, unofficially making sure the man she'd pulled back from cardiac arrest stayed pulled back. His pressure remained stable. His oxygen saturation remained where it needed to be. His eyes opened briefly around 7 a.m., and he tried to speak, but the ventilator tube prevented words. Hannah simply placed a hand on his arm. The touch carried weight it didn't used to carry. It carried the knowledge that she'd just done something Hargrove would use against her, something that crossed a line she was supposed to never cross, something that had shown her hand in a way that years of invisibility had been designed to prevent. But the veteran was alive. That was the equation that mattered, the calculus of medicine that transcended policy and hierarchy and the careful fiction that she was just a nurse who followed orders. She'd kept him alive when his own body had turned against him, when the surgeon brought in to save him had frozen, when the system had failed and only one person in that room knew how to fix what was breaking. The question wasn't whether she'd made the right call. The question was what happened next. Dr. Hargrove activated his network immediately. Friday morning, 6:56 a.m., before the coffee finished brewing in the physician's lounge. His face was the color of storm clouds, jaw clenched so tight the veins in his neck stood out like rope. He sat in his office with the door locked, phone pressed to his ear, calling the hospital board president mid-golf game at Prestonwood Country Club. "We have a liability nightmare," Hargrove said, his voice sharp as a surgical blade. ICU nurse performed an authorized surgical intervention. "I need immediate investigation." The board president listened for 18 seconds, Hannah counted them later in her mind, the way soldiers count heartbeats, then gave the order. "Investigate. Suspend. Document everything." By 7:15 a.m., Hargrove was dialing Hannah's previous hospital in Virginia, the one where she'd worked for 3 years under her cover identity. His hands moved with the terrible precision of a man who'd learned to weaponize bureaucracy. He spoke to HR Director Patricia Olmsted, a woman Hannah had trained personally, had taught how to recognize a femoral artery bleed by skin pallor alone. Olmsted's voice cracked when she heard the questions. Employment dates. Background verification. Nursing licensure authenticity. Hargrove pressed like a prosecutor with a star witness. "Her credentials," he said. "There are inconsistencies. I need them documented." Olmsted couldn't lie. She'd been trained not to. But she also couldn't explain why those inconsistencies existed, why no one asked questions when Hannah arrived in 2016, why the paperwork had been handled with extreme discretion by the hospital administrator himself, a retired admiral. The conversation lasted for minutes. Long enough for Hargrove to smell blood in the water. By noon, the external HR investigator had arrived. Sandra Klein, mid-50s, professional distance in her eyes, carrying a leather portfolio that felt like a coffin. Hargrove walked her through the ICU, pointing out Hannah's locker, her work schedule, the pericardiocentesis procedure that had been witnessed by 6 staff members. "Nobody learns that kind of precision without formal trauma surgery training," he told Klein, his voice conversational, almost friendly. And her nursing degree was from Georgetown, 2015. "But look at her hands." He pulled up the security footage from Thursday night, the moment Hannah's hands moved without hesitation, the needle finding the exact location between ribs 5 and 6, pericardial fluid draining with a hiss of air escaping, the veteran's oxygen saturation climbing like a resurrection. "That's not a fresh graduate," Hargrove said. "That's someone who's done this in combat." Klein took notes. Page after page, her pen moving with mechanical efficiency. She asked for Hannah's background check, her nursing license, her continuing education records, her references. Hargrove provided everything, then leaned back in his chair like a man who'd just moved his final piece on a chessboard. "Something doesn't add up," he said quietly. "And I want to know what." The investigator worked through Friday afternoon, making phone calls, cross-referencing dates, examining the consistency between Hannah's stated experience and her demonstrated expertise. By 2:06 p.m., Hargrove had his ammunition. Inconsistencies. Gaps in the official record. A nursing license that showed no trauma certification but hands that moved like a trauma surgeon. Nothing that would hold up in court. Everything that would hold up in an employment hearing. At 3:15 p.m., Hannah was called to the administrator's office. She knew before she arrived what this was. The summons came through an email marked urgent, the kind of email that arrives like a sniper's bullet, precise and final. She walked through the ICU one last time, past the monitors beeping their steady rhythm, past the ventilators wheezed like dying animals, past the nurses she'd trained and the patients whose lives she'd held in her hands. Her colleagues watched her go. Nobody said anything. The room went the way it goes when someone is being led away. Silent. Still. Aware. The administrator, a woman named Carolyn Price who'd hired Hannah sight unseen based on a single phone call from a retired 4-star admiral, sat behind her desk with the expression of someone delivering a eulogy. "Hannah, you're being suspended pending investigation into credential fraud and unauthorized medical procedures. Effective immediately. You'll surrender your badge and your access codes. Security will escort you from the building. Her voice was professional, sympathetic, which somehow made it worse. This wasn't personal. It was institutional. It was machinery. And machinery had no mercy. Security arrived 4 minutes later. A guard named Jerome, who'd always nodded at Hannah when she arrived for night shift, who'd held the ER door open for her 100 times without knowing what he was looking at. He held a cardboard box. Hannah's coffee mug. A photo of Emma, her daughter, age 14, laughing at the beach. A single succulent plant she'd kept on her locker. That was it. 8 months of work, and it fit in a box the size of a microwave. Jerome's face was apologetic. "I'm sorry, Ms. Clarke. Just doing my job." She didn't respond. She was already somewhere else, already deep in the compartment where soldiers live, the place where orders are executed and emotion is filed away in a locked drawer. They walked through the main corridor together, Jerome's hand never touching her arm but present enough that the message was clear. This was not a resignation. This was a removal. Past the ICU nurses' station, where 20 people looked up from their monitors and charts and watched her go. Past the staff lounge where Dr. Hargrove stood at the window with his arms crossed, his expression the satisfied look of a hunter who'd successfully tracked and cornered his prey. He wasn't smiling. He didn't need to. The light in his eyes was victory, pure and crystalline. Hannah walked to her car in the parking lot. The November air was cold, sharp as broken glass. Rain threatened in the darkening sky. She set the box on the passenger seat, hand steady as surgical steel, and drove home to her empty house with its empty kitchen and the daughter who was still in school, still believing that the world made sense, still thinking that her mother was just a tired nurse who worked too many night shifts. That evening, when Emma came home from school at 3:42 p.m., she found her mother sitting at the kitchen table still wearing her scrubs, still wearing the hospital ID badge she'd forgotten to surrender, and Hannah was crying. Not the quiet tears of sadness. The trembling kind. The kind that comes from having survived something and knowing that survival might not be enough. Emma dropped her backpack and crossed the kitchen in 3 steps. "Mom? Why are you home early?" Her voice was 14 years old and terrified and full of the kind of love that children give their parents without understanding what they're protecting them from. Hannah couldn't speak. She couldn't explain that she'd been ordered to disappear in 2019 after a classified hostage extraction in Ramadi went sideways, that the mission had been buried not in failure but in something worse, illegal authorization, executive-level decisions that somebody's Pentagon office needed to be forgotten. She couldn't explain that Senior Chief Petty Officer Hannah Clarke had been officially declared dead, her records erased, her decorations locked in a vault somewhere in Washington, D.C. that only 3 people could access. She'd been given a new name, a new social security number, a new life that was supposed to be safe, supposed to be quiet, supposed to involve being invisible forever. She'd been explicitly told by the Rear Admiral who'd placed her, "You speak of that life to anyone, you surface in any way, your entire team is retroactively disavowed." 23 sailors. 23 families. They lose everything. Their pensions. Their healthcare. Their honor. You want that on your conscience, Senior Chief. The words had settled into her like a stone. And for 6 years, she'd been invisible. She'd been just a nurse. Just someone who worked too much and loved her daughter and never, ever used the skills that had saved a room full of hostages in a building that officially never existed. But the combat boots in her closet were real. The scars on her hands were real. The muscle memory that had made her hands move without hesitation when the veteran's heart had stopped, that was real, and it couldn't be unseen. Emma sat down beside her, taking her mother's hand the way children do, with the assumption that touch alone can fix something broken. "Mom." Hannah pulled her daughter close and held her, breathing in the smell of her hair, the ordinary miraculous smell of her ordinary miraculous daughter, and tried to figure out how to explain that being good at saving lives was exactly the thing that was going to destroy the one life she'd fought every day to build. "Just a bad day, honey," Hannah whispered, but Emma, smart, observant Emma, held tighter and didn't believe a single word. The next morning arrived grey and indifferent, the kind of November sky that pressed down on Raleigh like a hand. Hannah sat in the hearing room at 7:56 a.m., her dress uniform hidden under scrubs that smelled of bleach and her own cortisol. Her lawyer, a woman named Patricia who'd been recommended by someone Hannah couldn't name, sat beside her reviewing documents they both knew were fabrications. The hospital board president was reviewing his coffee. Dr. Hargrove was reviewing his phone. Nobody was reviewing the patient charts. That was when the ICU alarm went off. Not a monitor alarm. The kind of alarm that meant incoming trauma, incoming crisis, incoming wait that couldn't wait for bureaucracy to finish its slow strangulation of procedure. Hannah's head lifted like a hunting dog catching scent. The room fell silent. Everyone, the board president, the investigator Hargrove had hired, Hannah's lawyer, everyone paused as if the hospital itself had spoken. Footsteps thundered past the hearing room door. A stretcher rolled past the window. And then a voice crackled through the overhead, ICU bed, male, 28, asylum seeker, acute surgical complication. Hannah's body recognized the voice of the charge nurse before her mind caught up. She'd trained that charge nurse. She'd taught that charge nurse how to triage impossible patients with nothing but time pressure and clinical intuition. The lawyer placed a hand on Hannah's arm. Hannah didn't move. The hearing continued. Hargrove continued preparing his presentation on credential fabrication. The hospital continued its machinery of judgment. But the ICU didn't wait. 30 minutes later, the board president's phone buzzed. Then Hargrove's. Then Hannah's lawyers. The messages were identical. Critical patient requires advanced nursing assessment. ICU requesting senior staff immediately. The board president's jaw tightened. He looked at Hargrove. Hargrove was already on his feet, his presentation abandoned on the table like evidence at a crime scene. He walked toward the door with the purposeful stride of a surgeon who still believed he was the most important person in any room. Hannah didn't move. The board president watched her. "You're excused," he said. "Go." She stood slowly. Not fast. Not eager. Moving like a woman who'd been sitting in the dark long enough to know where all the walls were. The hallway outside the hearing room smelled like antiseptic and rain. Someone had left the ER doors open. She walked toward the ICU at something close to her normal pace, though her muscles had already begun the slow revolution of remembering what they were designed to do. The ICU was controlled chaos. That was the language for it. But Hannah could read chaos the way some people read music. She could see the pattern underneath the noise. Hargrove was already at the new patient's bedside, examining the chart with the expression of a man trying very hard to remember which disease the patient actually had. The charge nurse caught Hannah's eye across the room and gave her the smallest nod. The incoming patient was a man in his late 30s, his skin the color of old parchment, his breathing shallow and labored. His surgical site was infected. His albumin was bottomed out. His body was trying to die and nobody had brought the right equipment to stop it. But those weren't the details that made Hannah stop moving altogether. The man's eyes found hers across the ICU. Recognition moved through them like electricity through copper wire. His hand lifted. It trembled. "You," he said in accented English. "You, the American woman." His voice cracked on the words. "You saved my brother. Ramadi. When your team had no reason to." No reason. The entire ICU stilled. Hannah could feel it, the sudden atmospheric pressure change, the way air moves when someone has just spoken a truth too large for the room to hold. Hargrove's head snapped toward the patient. The charge nurse's fingers stopped moving. A resident who'd been checking for lines froze mid-motion like someone had paused the film. Hannah's composure was like armor made of carbon fiber and old scars. She moved to the patient's bedside with steady hands and said nothing. The man reached for her arm, his grip surprisingly strong for someone whose body was failing. "I am Khalid," he said. "My brother was with the group you extracted. 12 of us. 12. Tears moved down his face. "I am here for political asylum. I am alive because my brother is alive." My brother is alive because of you. Hargrove's face had gone the color of old concrete. His mouth opened. Closed. His presentation suddenly seemed very small and very far away. Hannah was already moving, assessing the patient's abdomen, checking the surgical site, reading the labs with the speed of someone who'd done field triage in conditions that made this look like a resort spa. But her mind was doing something else entirely. Her mind was already 3 moves ahead, already understanding what was about to walk through those doors. The board president appeared at the ICU entrance. He was no longer alone. Hannah's daughter Emma stood beside him, her face set with the kind of determination that looked familiar because it was genetic. Behind them came 2 men in dress uniforms so precisely creased they looked weaponized. Behind them came someone with a government ID that caught the fluorescent lights and threw them back like a shield. This hearing is resumed, the board president said, and his voice had changed. It had developed edges. In the ICU. Now. The space around the patient's bed was suddenly very crowded. Emma pushed forward until she could see her mother clearly, until there was eye contact across the surgical equipment and the monitors and the impossible machinery of institutional power. She took a breath. The kind of breath that came before a declaration. The kind of breath that changed architecture. My mother, Emma said, her voice steady in a way that made Hannah's chest contract, is Senior Chief Petty Officer Hannah Clarke. The silence lasted exactly 2 seconds. Then the paralyzed veteran, James Rodriguez, whose name Hannah now understood had never been just James Rodriguez at all, pulled himself up on the hospital bed despite the incision, despite the pain, despite the doctors who suddenly looked very confused about their own room. He held a folder. His hands trembled but not with fear. With something that looked like pride. 3 combat tours, he said, reading from the declassified file that should have remained classified forever. 17 field surgeries performed under fire. Emergency medicine in conditions that would destroy most people's minds. He looked up at Hargrove. Navy Cross. 2 silver stars. The only medic in the extraction team who stayed conscious after the ambush. One of the uniformed men stepped forward. He was older, his shoulders the kind of wide that came from carrying things no civilian could imagine. I'm Captain Marcus Halloway, SEAL Team 3, he said. I flew in from San Diego last night because I needed to be here. He looked directly at Hannah. Senior Chief Clarke extracted 12 hostages from the Ramadi compound in 2019. While critically wounded. While under direct fire from 3 separate positions. While carrying a 7-year-old girl who'd been with insurgents for 14 months. Dr. Hargrove's face had drained of color. All of it. He looked like someone's ghost. The woman with the government ID stepped forward. Her badge read FBI, Counterintelligence Division. The mission was classified at the highest level, she said. Not because it failed. Because it succeeded in ways that exposed illegal CIA operations in the region. The classification was protective for the team, for the hostages, for the integrity of the operation. She looked at Hargrove with the expression of someone examining something that had crawled out from under a rock. Dr. Hargrove, you initiated an investigation into a protected federal witness. You filed fraudulent HR complaints against someone whose security clearance is higher than yours will ever be. You attempted to sabotage medical treatment for a patient in active recovery. She paused. That's 3 federal violations before we even get to state medical board conduct. Khalid, the new patient, was watching Hannah with tears moving silently down his face. Emma had moved to her mother's side. Rodriguez was still holding the declassified file. The charge nurse was standing very still, which meant she was standing in complete satisfaction. Hargrove opened his mouth. Closed it. His phone buzzed. Then buzzed again. Then again, like an insect trapped in a bottle. The board president spoke. His voice was the kind of calm that came right before institutions changed their minds forever. Dr. Hargrove, my office. Now. Your legal counsel should be present. I'm recommending to the state medical board that your license be suspended pending investigation. Hargrove walked out of the ICU like a man moving through water. Nobody followed him. Nobody needed to. The rest happened fast. The external investigator approached Hargrove in the hallway 3 minutes later. Hannah could hear them arguing through the walls, could hear the woman's voice like ice cracking. You told me her background was fabricated. You had me investigate a protected federal witness. My firm is terminating our contract with this hospital effective immediately and reporting your conduct to the state bar. By Tuesday afternoon, the state medical board had opened an inquiry. By Wednesday morning, Marcus Webb, the Marine combat medic who'd recognized Hannah's surgical technique weeks earlier, filed a formal complaint documenting Hargrove's pattern of dismissing nursing input despite patient safety risks. 2 residents and an attending physician corroborated the complaint. By Thursday, the hospital's legal counsel informed Hargrove he was being placed on administrative leave pending medical board investigation. By Friday afternoon, the same security guard who'd escorted Hannah out 3 days earlier knocked on Hargrove's office door. He held an identical cardboard box. "I believe you know the way out, sir," the guard said, his voice carrying profound satisfaction, and it wasn't a request. 6 months later, the ICU at Mercy General hummed with the particular energy of a unit that had learned to trust its nursing staff. Hannah Clarke ran it now, her Navy Cross displayed in her office alongside her nursing credentials. Both identities integrated. No longer hidden. James Rodriguez was taking his first independent steps, using parallel bars in the physical therapy room and wearing the worn combat boots that had triggered recognition on that first impossible day. Hannah stood beside him, her hand steadying his shoulder the way it had steadied countless others in the Ramadi sand. When he completed 10 full steps, the entire room erupted in applause. Emma was volunteering in the ICU now, shadowing her mother between calculus homework and college applications, considering military nursing, having tasted what it meant to serve something larger than herself. Marcus Webb worked alongside Hannah with the ease of shared combat experience. The papers were being written. The truth was being documented. And on a Tuesday afternoon, Hannah drove past a strip mall on her way home and saw Dr. Hargrove sitting at a folding table outside a discount insurance office, business cards stacked in front of him, his tie loosened in the summer heat. Their eyes met briefly. Hannah felt nothing except the quiet recognition that some people build others up while some tear them down, and consequences eventually find everyone. That evening, she opened her closet and looked at both pairs of worn combat boots, hers and the pair Rodriguez had given her, and for the first time in 4 years, she felt whole. If you've made it this far, thank you. If Hannah's story resonated with you, please like this video and subscribe to see more stories about the quiet heroes among us, the ones whose true strength nobody sees until the moment everything changes. Tell me in the comments, what would you have done in Hannah's position? Would you have kept your head down, or would you have risked everything for a stranger? These are the conversations that matter.